Hello, this is Dr. Weisslugel, and this is a presentation on Aristotle's teaching about the virtues, focusing especially on Book 2 and Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So what is virtue? Virtue, arete, means excellence. It's doing something well. And in a wide sense, virtue could pertain to just about anything. For instance, we use the word virtuoso to describe somebody who plays, for instance, the cello very, very well, a virtuoso cellist. We can also say if somebody possesses certain characteristics, they have certain virtues. For instance, if someone were detail-oriented and very organized, we might say that they possess the virtues of an accountant. So virtue just means to do anything well. It doesn't mean anything like prudish necessarily. Sometimes that word virtue might take on a sort of a Victorian kind of quality to it in the way we use it, but it doesn't mean that at all. Just think of virtue as excellence. According to Aristotle, then, there are two main types of virtues that human beings develop or hope to develop. The moral virtues, sometimes referred to as the virtues of character or excellences of character, and the intellectual virtues, the virtues of thought or virtues of mind. So remember the structure of the soul according to Aristotle. We remember that the soul can be described in terms of its various functions, that there are two main groups of functions performed by the human soul, the non-rational functions, which include our vegetative and nutritive functions, and our appetites and desires, or functions of a perfectly healthy human being. And on the other hand, we have a set of rational functions, subdivided again by the object of our thought. We can either think about changing things or we can think about unchanging things. And if excellence or virtue is about doing something well, then the virtues, the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues will be about our soul functioning well. Remember we said that the sphere of morality consists of the fact that human souls have two things going on. First, they have their appetites and desires, which are non-rational in their origin. You don't have to think them up to be hungry or fatigued or desire certain things. But once these desires occur to you, then you also have rational functionality, which allows you to think about those desires, think about how you're going to satisfy them, in what manner and at what time, and so forth. And that's the sphere of morality, in that in satisfying our appetites and desires, because we're rational beings, we are open to praise or blame for the choices and the actions that we make. So let's talk about moral virtues. We want to be praised. We don't want to be blamed. We want to make our choices with excellence. We want to satisfy our appetites and desires in the right way. So moral virtue. A summary is that simple. When you're acting and choosing, aim at a mean between extremes. Well, it's easy to say, but what does that mean, to aim at the mean between extremes? Well, what is a mean, first of all? In mathematics, it's an average. And there's a formula, an algorithm to perform to determine the mean of a series of numbers. For instance, you sum the series of numbers and then you divide by the number of numbers in the series. So for instance, if I want to get the mean of grades, one student got a 2 and one student got a 10, I perform the algorithm, the formula. I sum the series, so 2 plus 10 equals 12, and then I divide by the number of numbers. There's two numbers, two grades, the grade of 2 and the grade of 10, and I divide 12 by 2 and I get 6. That's the mean between 2 and 10. And that answer is absolute in the sense that it's exactly the same for everyone, no exceptions. 6 is the mean between 2 and 10 a million years ago, and it will be a million years in the future in any place on the planet. No matter what the person's circumstances are, that's the mean. It's an absolute. The moral mean is not like that. The moral mean is a relative mean, not an absolute mean. It's a mean relative to us, as Aristotle says. And you can find this in Book 2, around 1106, lines 25 to 1106b, maybe 7, looking at the text here. And if you're using the edition of the book that I suggested, it's on page 24. So, for instance, this is Aristotle's example. How much food should I eat? For anyone, 2 pounds per day is too little and 10 pounds is too much. So I'm supposed to aim at a mean. Does that mean I'm supposed to eat 6 pounds of food? And the answer is, well, it depends on who you are. Well, let's take an example between Michael Phelps, the Olympic gold medalist swimmer, and a philosopher like myself. Michael Phelps maintains an extremely intense training program. If he were to eat 6 pounds of food on his regimen, it would not be enough food for him. He would need to eat more food than that to generate or to provide him with enough calories so that he could undertake his training routine. Uh, on the other hand, 10 pounds is still way too much food. It would weigh him down. He would sink like a stone. So 6 pounds, well, that might be the mathematical or arithmetic mean between 2 and 10, but 6 pounds of food, let's say, for Michael Phelps is too little. But on the other hand, if I were to eat 6 pounds of food and I sit in a chair or I stand in front of a class, I don't do that much, 6 pounds of food might still be too much food for me. Again, 2 pounds might be too little. I might be undernourished. But to eat 6 pounds for me might still be too much. Maybe the right amount for me is, say, 4 pounds, and the right amount for Michael Phelps is 8 pounds. But the point here is that anyone, Michael Phelps or couch potato philosopher, anyone can eat either too little or too much food, no matter who they are or what their circumstances might be. But to find the right amount of food, the amount that's the excellent, the just right amount of food to eat, it's going to depend on our circumstances. But again, no matter who you are, you still could err in either eating too much food or too little food. Every mean, every just right, then, is between two extremes: an extreme of deficiency, too little, or extreme of excess, too much. And that means that every virtue is sandwiched between two vices, so to speak. And note, virtue and vice are about habitual behavior, or better, it's about dispositions we have to act and choose in a certain kind of way. Dispositions. So, for instance, if you smoke one cigarette, you do not have the vice of smoking. You've done something that maybe you shouldn't have done. Maybe it's not an excellent thing to do to smoke a cigarette, but we wouldn't say that you have the vice of smoking. However, if you regularly smoke, then we'd say, oh, well, you've developed the vice of smoking. And virtues and vices work like that. They're not one-off behaviors. Now, a particular behavior, any individual behavior, could be a good behavior, a good choice, a good act, or it could be a bad choice or a bad act. That's true. But talking about virtue and vice, we're talking about regularities. We're talking about dispositions and habits. So let's take a look at this chart a little bit, and let's look at the graphic. There's a horizontal axis that describes both the excess of deficiency, too little of some action, and on the right-hand side you'll see the excess of the extreme of excess, of too much of a certain behavior, and in the middle, somewhere, not precisely in the middle like in math or arithmetic, but somewhere in the middle is just right. But note there's also a vertical axis that I've added to this: goodness. The higher up you go on the vertical axis, the better your act is. So if you're doing too little of something that you need to do, it's not very good. If you're doing too much of something, it's not very good. But somewhere in the middle, when you're doing the just right amount of what you're supposed to be doing, that's excellent. Notice it's not a sharp point, but sort of a curve. Somewhere up there in the middle is where excellence is. So now let's look at the table below. And we can do this, and we should do this to determine what the virtues are that we'd like to develop in life. But virtue and vice behavior is all about certain activities that we do. Okay, so we have to learn how to talk properly when we're talking about virtue and vices. Okay, the first thing we need to do is develop an understanding of the activities that we engage in, and it's those activities that we could do too much or too little of, according to Aristotle. So, for instance, all of us at one time or another feel fear. All of us feel fear. The comedian Jerry Seinfeld made an observation. He says, people's number one fear is speaking in public. Nobody likes to be called on to speak in public. It makes us very nervous. People's number two fear, according to Seinfeld, is death. So he observes that at a funeral, you would rather be the person in the ground than the person standing over giving the eulogy. I don't know if that's true, but we all know we have our fears, and we all need to control them. Now, it's possible, obviously, to be deficient in the control of our fear. We can control our fear too little. Another way of saying that is our fear could control us instead of us controlling our fear. If if we can't control our fear, if we have too little control over our fear, and we're habitually, dispositionally unable to control our fear, we would develop the vice of cowardice. Every time a twig snaps, we'd run for cover. Right? That's a person who's a coward. Now, if you think about it, you could also control your fear too much. If you Fear is in us to tell us something. Fear tells us that the world is a dangerous place. If humans did not evolve the sense of fear, we would not have evolved at all. We would have died out a long time ago. Fear lets us know that there's trouble. So if you were to clamp down on your fear so much that it didn't tell you anything, you didn't let it teach you anything about the world, you would end up acting very rashly, very recklessly. For instance, if we were soldiers and we're a small platoon, uh, and we're out on patrol and a twig snaps and I dive in the bushes, the rest of you are going to worry about me and say, wow, he's a very cowardly member of our platoon. I don't know if this guy's going to help us in our mission if he's always hiding every time there's a little noise. But on the other hand, if we're on this patrol, just our little platoon, and we come up over a rise and we see 10,000 heavily armed enemy troops in front of us, and if I say, come on, let's go get them and charge up over the hill, 20 of us, let's say, versus 10,000 of them, you would say that guy's crazy. It's reckless behavior. He can't do that. He should be afraid that it's 10,000 against 20. We need to have another plan in order to cope with our situation. So it is possible to control your fear too little, become a coward if you do that habitually. If you develop the disposition to ignore fear altogether and don't let it tell you anything, well, then you're going to act recklessly. And some people engage in risky behavior like parachute jumping. But a good parachute jumper, one that gets to do it more than one time, is somebody who always checks their pack before they go up. Somebody who says, oh, I don't need to check my pack, it doesn't really matter. They're not afraid enough. Again, fear is not paralyzing. Somebody will go up and jump repeatedly out of planes, but they have a fear of what happens if you don't do things right, and that teaches them, make sure you do things right. Make sure you check your pack before you go up. Don't act recklessly. So the mean between those, the person who controls their fear has the disposition, develop the disposition to control their fear the proper amount based on the circumstances, is somebody that we would say has the virtue of courage or bravery. Now, again, as Aristotle said, that mean, what's the right amount of control of fear, that's going to be relative to our situation, to our circumstances. Who are we talking about? If we're walking down the street and we see if I'm walking down the street and I see three young toughs assaulting an old lady, I don't think in my condition that I can go and fight off three young toughs. If I tried to do that, that might be reckless. But if I just ignored it or went away, that would be a cowardly act. I would have to do something like create a disturbance and call 911 and somehow break it up without actually trying to go fight those three. However, if I'm walking down the street and I am a trained Navy SEAL, which is one of the most highly trained, fearsome fighting force in the U.S. Navy, and I see three young toughs assaulting an old person, well, for me, it's no trouble to go dispatch those three people. They're all hitting the ground before they know I'm come up behind them. I'm trained to do that. So if I were to just call 911 or shout as a trained Navy SEAL, well, maybe that would be a bit of a cowardly act given the training that I've had and the type of person that I was meant to become as a Navy SEAL. Excuse me. So again, it depends on who we are and what our circumstances are. Let's take the next example. We all have to give money at a certain point, not just to charity, but just give money to pay a check or to buy an item at the store. It's something we all engage in all the time. If we developed a disposition to not give enough money for the right reasons, we are called stingy or cheap. On the other hand, if we develop the habit or the disposition to be giving money too much, trying to give away money that we don't have, maybe even running up our credit cards, we would say that we're spendthrifty. But a person who gives the right amount of money to the right people for the right reasons at the right time, as Aristotle likes to put it, that would be somebody who's developed the virtue of generosity. Now, again, how much money do we give? Is it that everyone gives $1,000 a year? That obviously can't be right. The amount of money that I give and the amount of money that, say, Bill Gates gives is different. There's a terrible, as I'm recording this, a terrible series of events going on in Japan. Now, if I were to send a check to the Red Cross for $300, based on what I make, that's a lot of money for me. So that's a lot for my family to give. It's not too much, but it's not too little. But it's a generous donation. If I were to try to give $500,000 by maxing out my credit cards, that would be a terrible mistake. That would be giving too much money. If I were to sit and do nothing, well, maybe I'm cheap. On the other hand, if Bill Gates wanted to do something to help the Japanese people and he gave $300, we would say, "Wow, Bill, $300? I mean, don't you have that in the cushions of your couch somewhere?" No, for the amount of money for Bill Gates to give, to be considered generous, is a function of how much money we think Bill Gates has to give. And the same applies for me. So both Bill Gates and I are supposed to be generous, both of us. But how we're generous, how generosity manifests itself or shows itself in our lives, that's going to be different depending on our circumstances. Okay, so our idea is to aim at a mean relative to us between extremes of behavior. Now, how do we know what that right amount is? Aristotle says we learn that by doing, by being trained to do that. And we start through imitation or examples. If I want to know generosity, I find somebody who's generous and I try to do it their way. I don't try to give exactly the same amount of money they give, but I try to do it their way. If I'm trying to develop the virtue of courage, then I need to put myself in situations where I experience fear and I learn by doing to control my fear, and I learn what that control looks like by imitating others, finding someone in my community who's thought to be brave and try to do it their way. Again, not do exactly what they do, but try to do it the way that they do it by hitting that mean between extremes. And the idea in all this activity, this doing, is to develop a habit or better disposition. If you read about Aristotle's moral philosophy, uh, you'll see a discussion sometimes about whether the right word is habit or disposition. Some people say habit is a kind of a bad thing. It's something that's mindless, that once you have a few cigarettes, then all of a sudden you have the habit of smoking. Whereas a disposition is an inner transformation of the kind of person you are. It makes you likely to do the right thing in right circumstances. So maybe we should say that the development of moral virtue is the development of a disposition to behave properly, an ongoing pattern of the correct behavior. And note that, as we said, virtue, this mean between extremes, this middle, is in no way a mediocrity. Sometimes we say, well, it's neither too hot nor too cold, it's just sort of mediocre. That's not a good way to understand Aristotle. The mean, the middle, is an excellence. It's high up on that chart of goodness, as we saw. It's as good as it gets. So that, in summary, leaves us to consider a couple different kinds of moral positions. This isn't from Aristotle. I'm just describing some ways we think about morality. Some moral positions we might call absolutely absolute. That means there's one right way for everyone. Now, here's an example of an absolutely absolute moral position. There's no divorce. Yeah, but he was beating me. I don't care. But I don't love him. I don't care. She's mean to me. I don't care. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are. You cannot get divorced. That's a moral position that some people hold. There's another kind of moral position that we could call, let's say, absolutely relative. That in effect, that would mean that there's no right way to do anything. Everyone does what she or he feels like doing at the time, and the justification for what they're doing is they feel like doing it. That's it. That what's right is completely relative to me and whatever I happen to be thinking at the moment. And that's effectively to say there is no right way to do anything. It's an anything goes. It's a bit chaotic if you think about it, but some people suggest that there are no moral rules or principles whatsoever. It's the exact opposite of the absolutely absolute position. On that one, there's one right way for everyone. In absolutely relative position, there's no right way for anyone. Now, there's a third that I'll call relatively absolute, and I think this is Aristotle's position. There is an absolute in Aristotle because everyone, no matter what their circumstances, no matter who they are, ought to develop the virtues. Everyone, absolutely, no matter what, ought to be brave and generous and witty and kind and whatever virtues that we'd want to develop. Those apply to everyone no matter what their circumstances. Rich and poor, you should be generous. No matter what your job is, you ought to be courageous. But on the other hand, there's a relative element to this too, because Aristotle recognizes that everyone will develop these virtues that all of us ought to develop, absolutely. We're going to develop them in accordance with our own circumstances. So absolutely, we should be generous, but relative to our circumstances. And I think this is a strength of Aristotle's moral philosophy, that it's a relatively absolute position. You can make judgments about people. You can call Bill Gates cheap, and you could also call him spendthrifty. Bill Gates could spend too much money, even though he has that much money. He could conceivably spend too much money. You can call somebody who's a trained military person who's taught to go into very difficult circumstances. You could still call that person rash or reckless. So I think this is a strength of Aristotle's position. Let me just make a note here. Just thought about it to remind you of something about a way to talk. Try not to say things like too generous or too brave. Try to avoid talking like that because you can't be too generous or too brave. Bravery and generosity are already an extreme. They're extremely good. It's what you're meant to be. It's the best you can be. What you can be is too controlling of your fear. And that's not being brave at all. That's being reckless. What you can be is too giving of your money. And that's not generous at all anymore. That's spendthrifty. So I know in ordinary language we sometimes say, boy, that person's too generous or that person's too brave. But if you want to speak precisely, there's no way to be too brave or to be too generous. Bravery and generosity are descriptions of the quality of your behavior. Your behavior is just right. It's not too anything. It's not too much or it's not too little. It's just right. And when it's just right, we say you have a virtue. All right. So those are the moral virtues. And now let's talk about the other main group of virtues that Aristotle talks about, the intellectual virtues. Now again, go back to our structure of the soul. Now we're going to talk strictly about the left-hand side of this, the rational functions. Both are thinking about changing things and are thinking about unchanging things. And these are the intellectual virtues, and they're discussed in book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Now these are learned not by training so much, but what Aristotle says is by teaching. Now it's a little bit unclear what he's talking about here, but he says we learn our intellectual virtues in an intellectual process. In other words, you could teach a child to be generous with her toys, either by, as we say, the carrot or the stick. We could punish them if they're not generous, or we can give them a cookie every time they share their toys. That's a kind of a training, and the child could develop the virtue of generosity, of being willing to share her toys, without really knowing why that's a good idea. Understand? You could teach a soldier to be brave, in other words, to have the proper amount of control over her fear, without the soldier understanding or knowing why that's the right amount of control over the fear and why that's important. So I think that's what Aristotle's talking about. in this difference between teaching and training. Intellectual virtues are not means between extremes, but the intellectual virtue aims at an extreme. More knowledge and understanding is always better. Now, you may know someone, or you may even be someone who other people say thinks too much. Did you ever hear that one? People think too much. Well, when we say that, we have to try to understand what we're really saying about a person who thinks too much. We're really not complaining about their thinking so much as we're complaining about their doing, or more specifically, they're not doing certain things. In other words, they think and think, but they fail then to act, to do something based on their thinking. It's not so much that thinking is bad, it's that the inaction is bad. Really, you can't think too much or know too much or understand too much in and of itself. It's just how that plays out in your life, in your action, in your doing. And I think that's really what we're complaining about. So for Aristotle, any amount of thinking is good, more thinking is better. Any amount of understanding or knowing is good, and more is always better. And if you could just think of the rational side of our soul is always about thinking. So in some ways, it's just kind of one thing, thinking. In the moral virtues, we saw lots of different activity. Giving money is not the same thing as controlling fear and regulating your speech. Those are three different things. But in the rational side, we're basically talking about thinking. But it is true that we think in various ways about various things. And that's where the distinction of the intellectual virtues is going to be drawn from. So Aristotle says there's 5 intellectual virtues. The first is techne. That's the word we get our word technology or technique from. And techne is defined as any art, skill, applied science. Basically, I like to think of it as just know-how. If you have the know-how to bring about change in the world, you have techne. So if you know how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you possess techne. Uh, and what are you doing when you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Well, you are changing the world. Not in a huge way, but you're changing it. It goes from being a world that does not have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in front of you to being a world where there is a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in front of you that you can eat. So you can see where techne comes into play when we want to satisfy our appetites and desires. In this case, our appetite, our hunger. We use techne, a technology, a technique for satisfying that hunger. We take out 2 slices of bread, we smear the peanut butter on, we smear the jelly on, put together, cut it in half. That's the techne, right? And it's not just about electronics or, or, or high technology, those kind of things. But no, any simple thing that you're able to do, you know how to do, that's a techne. Aristotle says there's also an intellectual virtue called phronesis, which is defined as prudence or practical wisdom. And if techne is knowing how to do something, phronesis is knowing, in effect, whether to do something and why and under what circumstances. Now, one way we can see how these work together is suppose my little nephew comes to me and he says, Uncle Eric, would you help me with my homework assignment? My homework assignment is I have to write a report on how to make a nuclear bomb. I'm a little surprised by that homework assignment, but what could I tell him to do? How could I help him with his homework assignment? He needs to know how to make a nuclear bomb. Well, I think if you think like me, the first thing you do is say, well, let's Google it. Let's go on the internet and see if we can find out how to make a nuclear bomb. Now, I've never done this because I don't want the police to come to my house because they see I'm looking on to make a nuclear bomb. So I've never really tried this. But my guess is something would come back. Some kind of instructions would come back about how to make a nuclear bomb. Or I could tell my little nephew, okay, look, you need to learn certain mathematics, certain physics, some engineering. You can go to school. Let's go down to the university and talk to the professors in those areas. And then eventually we could learn how to make a nuclear bomb. Okay, and then he asked me, no, wait a minute, my assignment is different. I don't need to know how to make a nuclear bomb. I need to write a report on whether to use a nuclear bomb. Well, now how can I help him? Would I send him to the internet? Oh my goodness, what would that be like? Should I set off a nuclear bomb? The Google will come back with, yes, set it off now, let God sort them out. All kinds of craziness is likely to happen. So we wouldn't do that. What would we do? How would we try to learn that? Might be relatively easy to learn how to make a nuclear bomb. My nephew's pretty precocious. He probably could. But what would it take to have the practical wisdom to decide whether to ever use it. Well, you could study the history of when it was used and why it was used. We think about all those things, but even then, at the end of the day, even having all the information about why the nuclear bomb was used and when it was used and for what reasons it was used, we still wouldn't know with the same kind of certainty whether to use a nuclear bomb as we would have the certainty of how to make one. So techne and phronesis have to play in together. In any little circumstance of life, we're having a dinner party and we're going to make spaghetti. I know how to make spaghetti, but I need to try to figure out how much spaghetti to make and when to put it in so that it's ready for the guests when they arrive and so forth. There's techne and phronesis, and those always work together. And they work together in a world that deals with change, with changing things and with our changing the world. So these are two intellectual virtues that appear on the rational side of the soul that deals with changing things. Now, there are other virtues. There's one called nous, or sometimes translated as mind or intellect or understanding or insight or intuitive knowledge. Our word gnosis comes from this. When somebody says they're an agnostic, you can hear the Greek word nous in there. That means they don't know. In effect, nous is the ability to grasp, just grasp, without a process of reasoning, just grasp the first principles behind anything that we're interested in. I'll come back to that in a second. Let me also then describe episteme. When we talked about the branches of philosophy, we said there was one called epistemology, and that was about knowledge and truth. And episteme as an intellectual virtue, sometimes translated as science, but science, is a reasoning process that we reason from the first principles, kind of like a logical reasoning. There's a process aspect. So nous, in some sense, is kind of an instantaneous grasp, and episteme is a process, a reasoning process. Now, maybe it's the best way to explain these two is to explain them together with an example. So, everybody knows the Pythagorean theorem in geometry: a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The square of the hypotenuse is the sum of the square of the sides of a right triangle. That's what the Pythagorean theorem is all about. Now, how did Pythagoras come up with his theorem? Think about that for a second. It has his name on it. So how did he come up with that theorem that a squared plus b squared equals c squared in a right triangle? How did he come up with that? Did he test every right triangle possible? No, he didn't, because I'm scribbling a right triangle on my piece of paper right here, and I know he didn't check that one to find out if a squared plus b squared equals c squared, because he's long dead. He doesn't know anything about this triangle. No, what happened was he was thinking about triangles and thinking about them, and then all of a sudden, I think he had what we call an aha experience, or a perfectly good Greek word, eureka. I found it. I get it. I see. So when you have that feeling of, oh, yeah, I get that, that's nous operating within you. Now, suppose I have to take a test right now, and I say, well, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and I have to figure out, well, what is the length of the hypotenuse when the height is 3 and the base is 4? Well, if 3 squared is 10 and 4 squared is 20, then the length of the hypotenuse is the square root of 30. Well, what? None of that mathematics is correct, what I was saying there. That's no good. If I don't know how to reason from these first principles, if I don't even know how to get started, if I can't do the calculating part of the mathematics, I'm never going to end up with the answer that I need, which is what is the length of this hypotenuse. It's not enough just to say, well, I know the relationship between the hypotenuse and the sides. It's possible that I don't know how to reason from that insight that this is how it works. I'm stuck in the mud here until I know how to reason. And in the same light, I could have the episteme. I could be a really good calculator. Look, you tell me the formula, and I can come up with the answer. But the problem is, I don't know the formula. I don't get the relationship between the hypotenuse and the sides of a right triangle. If I don't have both nous and episteme, if I don't know that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, then I can't figure out that 3 squared is 9 and 4 squared is 16, and you add those together, and you get 25, and the square root of 25 is 5, so the hypotenuse is 5. If I can't do all of that, then I'm not really good at geometry. And if I have those both together, you would say that in terms of geometry, I am theoretically wise. I have the combination of nous, the ability to grasp and understand the first principles, and episteme, the ability to develop a science from that, a process of reasoning so they come to have knowledge of things in this world. And these three intellectual virtues deal with the unchanging or immutable things of the world, because we're talking about, for instance, in that case, mathematics, and mathematics holds for us, it held for people a million years ago, it will hold for people a million years hence. So the three intellectual virtues of nous, episteme, and sophia, these are the intellectual virtues that deal with unchanging things, and techne and phronesis are the intellectual virtues that deal with changing things. So here's a summary of how this looks, and notice I've sort of shifted this around a little bit. Normally I would have techne and phronesis on the side of deals with changing things, and nous, episteme, and sophia on the side that deals with unchanging things. But notice I put nous kind of on the line between those two categories. I put it on the line for this reason. Suppose you have a problem with changing things. There's a river, and you need to get to the other side of the river. But at the moment, you don't know how you're going to get to the other side of the river. And you decide you want to build a bridge. Well, that's going to take some techne, isn't it? That's going to take some know-how. You're going to need to know what materials work for bridge building. You'll need to know some of the ways to put a bridge together, to get the bridge put together from one side of the river to the other. It's going to take some phronesis too, isn't it? Is this the right place in the river to build the bridge? Is it worth the amount of money and work that it's going to take to build a bridge? Maybe there's a better way to do it. Let's say getting a rowboat instead of building a bridge. So you're going to need, as you would expect, techne and phronesis to know how and whether to build this bridge. But I think behind that is a certain grasp or understanding. It might be inarticulate. You might not have the episteme or the science to go with it, but there's a grasp of certain things like physics. You don't need physics class to understand that if I hold something in the air and let go of it, it will fall. So if I try to just throw a bridge up over top of the river, it's just going to fall into the river. Now, I never really have to have that as a conscious thought because my nous already grasped that that's the unchanging way the world works. Scientists and mathematicians can come up with a whole theory of gravity. I don't need that whole episteme. I don't need that whole science. I don't need to be theoretically wise to get it that things fall when you drop them. That it takes a certain amount of force to leap over a river, which I don't possess. I already get the way the world is. So even in our practical world of dealing with change, behind those changing circumstances is an unchanging pattern or structure, let's call it, of the way the world is. And all of us have at least some kind of grasp of that. It's because we do have some kind of grasp of the unchanging structure behind things that both we can do things in the practical world and we decide to engage in theoretical pursuits, in the sciences to say, well, how come that is when you drop a rock from a height, it falls? Why does that work like that? I know that it will, I get that it will, but now I want to understand it. That leads me on to develop my sciences, my episteme. So I think nous is at work both in our theoretical pursuits where we just want to know, and in our practical pursuits when we want to know in order to get something done, to change things, to satisfy a need or a desire that we have. So that's the basic understanding of the five intellectual virtues according to Aristotle. So what's next? As we said at the end of our previous presentation, we need to find the highest virtue of the soul, because when we find it, we will have found the meaning of true happiness for human beings, and that will order. That is our final cause. That is how we're meant to be according to Aristotle. And so that will order all of our actions and choices in life. That will help us to develop the virtues. That will help us to be morally good in our journey towards ultimate fulfillment. Aristotle says happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, and if there's more than one, in accordance with the highest virtue. We've seen a lot of functions of the human soul. We've discussed some ways in which those functions can be excellent, in other words, virtues. We only need to figure out now what is the highest virtue, and I'll leave it for you to discover.